Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Beurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Beurah Chelik Gimel, and Mir Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Beis Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on Daf Kuf Beis Amid Aleph, 4 lines off the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch, in the middle of the line, by the words Avol Bidavar She'ein Baitzad Heter La'asoisai. Our learning should be a schus for Achedu Beis Yisrael Hanasuna Batzara Bashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayom Bein Bayabasha Hamakayim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yitziim Yitzar Lirvacha Me'afela La'ira Mishibad L'Geula Hashta Bagala V'Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus refuah shalema from Shemeir ben Esther Fradl Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha Rivka bas Shiraleah Chava Hadassah bas Serel. They should have a refuah shalema b'sar Shar Chel Yisrael. Our learning should be a schus for Yonasan ben Michal, Yoel ben Michal, together with all of our others, brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. B'chol Makom Shehem. We just recently heard that the fighting, unfortunately, has fired up again surrounding Eretz Yisrael. The Berurah should watch over all of our brothers and sisters. Okay, so we continue here in Siman Shin Zayin. We're in the middle of Sif Ches, again, 4 lines off the bottom. Near the middle of the line, the word Avol. So, we've been learning here in Siman Shin Zayin the halachas of Mimtzoi Cheftzecha and Daber Davar. More negea to us right now is the Isser of Daber Davar. You're not allowed to discuss on Shabbos something that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. So a very basic example of that is that on Shabbos, you're not allowed to say, tonight I'm going to drive to Monsey. Tonight I'm going to drive to Lakewood. Why? Because you're not allowed to drive on Shabbos. You're not allowed to drive on Shabbos. You're not allowed to discuss driving on Shabbos. You can't say, wow, the grass is tall. I'm going to cut the grass tomorrow. You're not allowed to cut grass on Shabbos. Therefore, you're not allowed to discuss cutting grass on Shabbos. Having said that, there's an interesting exception to this rule that we spoke about yesterday, and that is the halacha of tchum. You're not allowed to go out of the tchum on Shabbos, yet you are allowed to discuss on Shabbos going out of the tchum after Shabbos. So you're allowed to say on Shabbos, I'm going to go to Monsey tomorrow, even if Monsey is out of your tchum Shabbos. Now, I didn't say I'm going to drive to Monsey on Shabbos. I just said I'm going to go to Monsey on Shabbos. Now, you can't go to, I'm sorry, I didn't say I'm going to drive to Monsey after Shabbos. I said I'm going to go to Monsey after Shabbos. Now, you can't go to Monsey on Shabbos, assuming Monsey is out of your tchum, assuming you live in Lakewood. You can't go to Monsey on Shabbos because you can't go out of the tchum on Shabbos. Yet, you're allowed to discuss going out of the tchum after Shabbos on Shabbos. Why is that? So he explained, this is because the Isser of tchum is an Isser sheyesh by tzad heter. There is a way in which you can travel that distance that you're speaking about on Shabbos, and that would be if there were Borganin, if you would have the watchman huts every 70 amas and 4 tvachim going to the point that you want to go, so then the point that you want to get to would not be considered out of the tchum. So there's nothing inherent in the traveling that you're speaking about doing that's usher. I'm not going to go over it again and again and again. We did that already yesterday. But the bottom line is that the Isser of tchum is an Isser sheyesh by tzad heter. It's not something that's inherently usher. And therefore you're allowed to discuss doing it after Shabbos on Shabbos. You can talk about it on Shabbos. Now, says the Mechaber, Aval, however, B'davar she'ein by tzad heter la'asoisai hayom. Any kind of Isser Shabbos that does not have a tzad heter. There is no way to do it in a way that's mutter on Shabbos. Afilu im ein bayel Isser d'Rabbanan. Even if what we're speaking about is not an Isser d'Oraisa, it's only an Isser d'Rabbanan. So let's think about this for a second. Lighting a candle on Shabbos. Is there any way to light a candle on Shabbos beheter? No. So lighting a fire on Shabbos is an Isser she'ein bo tzad heter. There's no way to do it in an oifen that is mutter. And therefore, you can't say, I'm going to light a fire in the fireplace after Shabbos. Can't say that on Shabbos. Why? That's daber davar. There's no tzad heter in lighting a fire in the fireplace on Shabbos. So that would be a case of an issa d'oraisa. But then we have cases that are only an issa d'rabanan. So like the Mishnah Berurah is giving a good example here. He says, keep going. For example, sheyesh lo chutz l'tchum peros muktzim. Let's say you have apples that are located outside of the tchum, and they're muktzah. Kevan she'i efshar lo lahaviyam hayoim. Since there's no way to get those apples today on Shabbos in a way that's mutter, asur loyma l'chaveroi she'yaviyam lo lamachar. You're not allowed to discuss it on Shabbos. You're not allowed to tell your friend on Shabbos, I will bring you those apples tomorrow. Why? Because what isurim are going to be involved in getting the apples? If you wanted to get the apples today on Shabbos, what isurim would be involved? Well, one isur would be, in order to get the apples, you would have to go out of the tchum. Now, that's not a problem of daber davar, because going out of the tchum is an isur sheyesh by tzad heter. So you're allowed to discuss going out of the tchum on Shabbos. But in this case, there's a second problem. The second problem is that the apples that you're talking about are muktzah. Now, muktzah is an issa d'rabanan, and muktzah is an issa d'rabanan she'ein by tzad heter. If the apples are muktzah, the apples are muktzah. So, could you say to your friend, on Shabbos, could you tell your friend on Shabbos, I have apples outside of the tchum that are muktzah. I will go and get them and bring them to you tomorrow. No, you can't, because it's daber davar. What's the daber davar aspect? The fact that the apples are muktzah. Again, the fact that the apples are located outside of the tchum, that's not a problem of daber davar, because tchum is an iser sheyesh by tzad heter. But the fact that the apples of muktzah, that's an iser d'rabanan she'ein by tzad heter. And therefore, you can't talk about handling those apples on Shabbos, because that would be daber davar. Now, many of you are wondering, what exactly is a case of apples that are muktzah? So I had one case of apples that are muktzah, and that is if you're an apple merchant, and you have apples that are set aside as inventory for your business. So you're in the apple business. Sometimes you bring apples home. The apples that you have in your kitchen are not muktzah. But if you have apples that have been sorted by size and cased up, and they're in the warehouse, and they're set aside for sale, that's business inventory. Business inventory is muktzah. That was the case that I had in my mind. I saw the Beurah had a different case. The Beurah's case is apples of Orla. Orla, the fruit for the first 3 years, the fruit that grows on a tree for the first 3 years, are also bachila, they're also ba'ana, they're orla, so they're muktzah. Problem with that is, why would I be telling my friend that I'm going to bring him apples of orla? But whatever it is, so again, what's the halacha here that the mechaber is saying? The mechaber is continuing on the theme that we learned yesterday. Daber davar. You're not allowed to discuss anything on Shabbos that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. So anything that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos, you're not allowed to talk about doing it after Shabbos. Exception to the rule is a davar sheyesh by tzad heter. Something that theoretically there would be a way to do in a way that's mutter, and therefore it's not inherently asur. So traveling outside of the tchum is not inherently asur. That act of walking, that act of traveling, is not a maisa isser. It's not inherently asur. It's only asur because of an outside technicality. There are no structures. There are no borganin between here and there, and therefore it's added a tchum. That's an isser sheyesh by tzad heter. So you're allowed to talk about it on Shabbos, and you're allowed to say, I'm going to do it after Shabbos. But if it's an isser she'ein by tzad heter, then you're not allowed to talk about it on Shabbos. The mechaber gives us a case. The mechaber says, we were just talking about going out of the tchum. What if you have apples that are muktzah that are located outside of the tchum? Now there are two different isurim involved in going and getting those apples on Shabbos. One is the Isser of Tchum. That's an Isser Sheyesh by Tzad Heter. So as far as the Isser of Tchum, you would be allowed to say, I'm going to go get them after Shabbos and bring them to you. But these apples have an additional problem. They're muktzah. Muktzah is an Isser D'Rabbanan. Muktzah is an Isser She'ein by Tzad Heter. Therefore, if the apples are muktzah, you cannot say, I'm going to go get them after Shabbos and bring them to you after Shabbos, because it would be an Isser of Daber Davar. Says the Mishnah Beurah, Eis Cotton Lamed Daled. Chutz l'tchum peris muktzim. Kasar achronim d'achronim right. The lav dafka b'seif ha'tchum. Really, the Mishnah Beurah is being very medayik in the words of the Mechaber. In this case, to tell me that this case was aser, you didn't have to tell me that the apples are located outside of the tchum. Because again, as far as that variable, the Isser of tchum is an Isser sheyesh by tzad heter. So that wouldn't prevent me from discussing it. The thing that's preventing me from telling my friend I'm going to bring him these apples after Shabbos is the Isser of Muktzah. Elahu adin b'soichat tchum. In this case, with the apples of Muktzah, you wouldn't be allowed to tell your friend I'm going to bring you the apples after Shabbos, even if the apples are located inside the tchum. Because the problem over here is that the apples are Muktzah. And therefore, to talk about handling them is to talk about an Isser D'Rabbanan she'ein by Tzad Heter of Muktzah. Kevin d'ef shel aviyah mishum Isser Muktzah. Ela mishum seifa nakat hachi. The only reason the Mechaber really mentions the fact that these apples are located outside of the tchum is because of the halakha that's going to come soon. The lahachshich einay aser ela b'seifa tchum. To camp out at the edge of the tchum to get closer to these apples, that's only negeya if the apples are outside of the tchum. Ukidlakaban b'sif tes. Leilech sham lahaviyam. In this case, you're not allowed to tell your friend that I'm gonna. What did we do this yet? This is ice cotton lamed. Hey, we didn't do this yet. 2 lines off the bottom near the end of the line. V'chein says the Mechaber. Another halacha. V'chein, similarly, again, same case. You have apples that are muktzah that are located outside of the tchum. You're not allowed to discuss going to get them after Shabbos, because that's daber davar. You're talking about violating the Isser of muktzah on Shabbos, so you can't talk about it. V'chein, similarly, also loy lahachshich b'soif ha'tchum kedei sheyemaher halayla leilech sham lahaviyam. On Shabbos, if you want to get hold of these apples as soon as possible after Shabbos, you might be tempted to go to the edge of the tchum and be machshich, to spend Shabbos evening when it's getting dark, close to the end of Shabbos. You might want to be machshich at the edge of the tchum. Why? That way, as soon as you hit 72, as soon as it's Ois Shabbos, you could right away jump out of the tchum and get hold of the apples. Are you allowed to do that? No, you're not allowed to. You know why? Because since these apples are muktzah, so again, to get them on Shabbos is aser, because they're muktzah. If you go to the edge of the tchum on Shabbos and you camp out over there at the end of Shabbos, you're doing an activity on Shabbos in order to facilitate doing something that's aser on Shabbos. You're camping out at the edge of the tchum on Shabbos so that after Shabbos, you could go get the apples that are muktzah on Shabbos. So you're doing an activity, you're going to the edge of the tchum to facilitate doing something on Motzei Shabbos that is aser on Shabbos. That's mimtzah cheftzecha. So you're not allowed to do that. Says the Mishnah Berurah, hey, leilach sham lahaviyam, hainu elu ha'perish muktzah. Again, we're talking about the same case. We're talking about the apples that are muktzah. Avo perish she'eino muktzim. But how about if the apples are located outside of the tchum and they're regular apples? They're not muktzah. They're not business inventory. They're not orla. They're not tevel. They're not apples that you didn't take meiser from. They're regular good old apples that are not muktzah. So the only Shabbos issue over here is that they're located outside of the tchum. In that case, says the Mishnah Berurah, Kevin shemutter loyma l'chaveiro sheyaviyim loy la'achar Shabbos, mutter nami lahachshich b'shvilam. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying is like this. If the apples that are located outside of the tchum are not muktzah, are you allowed to camp out at the edge of the tchum on Shabbos in order to be able to get them quickly after Shabbos? Yes. Why? Because again, now the only thing preventing you from getting those apples on Shabbos is the Yisur Tchum. And the Yisur Tchum is an Yisur Sheyesh by Tzad Heter. Since the Yisur Tchum is an Yisur Sheyesh by Tzad Heter, you're allowed to talk about doing it on Shabbos. The same way you're allowed to talk about doing it on Shabbos, and that's not considered a violation of Daber Davar, you're also allowed to go to the edge of the Tchum on Shabbos and camp out over there at the end of Shabbos, and that's not called Mimtzoi Cheftzecha, because you're not doing an activity to do something after Shabbos that's inherently Asur on Shabbos. You're doing an activity, you're camping out at the edge of the Tchum to do something that's Asur on Shabbos, but it's Yesh by Tzad Heter. And that's okay. The same way it's not Daber Davar, it's also not Mimtzoi Cheftzecha. Okay, let's go weiter. Now we have an interesting Ramah. It's just complicated. The rules are very simple, but when you have to explain each case, it's complicated. That's why we're already 16 minutes into the shir. Says the Ramah. It gets a little easier. From here on out, it gets a little less complicated. Says the Ramah Hagah. V'chein, similarly, loy yoimar. A person is not allowed to say beinoy lebein atzmai, to himself. Some people, when they're thinking, they like to talk to themselves while they're thinking. Says the Ramah, v'chein, loy yoimar. A person should not say on Shabbos, esed davar ploini lamochar. I will do this and this thing, which is Asur on Shabbos. I'm going to do it tomorrow on Sunday. So you're home on Shabbos afternoon. Now we said that hirhur, strictly speaking, is mutter. You're allowed to think on Shabbos about doing things after Shabbos that are Asur on Shabbos. So you're not allowed to say, I'm going to drive to Muncie tomorrow. But you're allowed to think in your head, I'm going to drive to Muncie tomorrow. That you're allowed to do. We spoke about it would be a big inyan not to do that. But hirhur is not Asur. Therefore, says the Ramah, you might think, what if you're the only one home? You're all alone. And you're thinking out loud about your plans for the week. Are you allowed to say, tomorrow I think I'll drive to Muncie? You're not saying it to anybody. You're not discussing it with anybody. What you're really doing is you're thinking out loud. Yes, you're verbalizing it, but it's not having a discussion. You're talking it. You're saying it beinoy lebein atzmo. You're talking to yourself. Is that Asur? Says the Ramah. Yes, that is Asur. That's what the Ramah means over here. V'chein lo yoimar. A person should not say to himself, esed davar ploini lamachar. I will do this and this thing, which is Asur on Shabbos. I will do it tomorrow. V'ayin le'el reish hasimin. Says the Mishnah Beurah back on Kuf Beis Amud Aleph Ois Katan Lamed Vav. V'chein lo yoimar. This goes back on what the Mechaber said in the beginning. The Mechaber said, you're not allowed to tell your friend, I'm going to bring you the apples that are muktzah, that are located outside of the Tchum. I'm going to bring them to you tomorrow. You're not allowed to say that on Shabbos. Right? Says the Ramah on that, the Kamash Malon, the Ramah is teaching me, the loy nema, you should not say, the dafka kishemedaber im chaveroi, that it's only when you're speaking to somebody else, umisyoitz imoi, and you're having a discussion with him, who the Asur. You might think the only time Daber Davar is Asur is when you're having a discussion with somebody else. Because if you're talking to somebody else, you're accomplishing something. You're making plans with somebody else. You're giving somebody else information that he needs. Maybe that's the only time Daber Davar is Asur. Daber Davar is Asur when there's a point to the speaking. If there's no point to the speech, maybe it's not considered Daber Davar. But when you talk to yourself, when you're not accomplishing anything, maybe Shari, maybe that's mutter. Says the Ramah, Kamash Balad, the Ramah's teaching me. Kevan dehu davar asur lasos b'Shabbos, since you're talking about something that is asur to do on Shabbos, af keshevedaber beinoy lebein atzmai, even if you're talking to yourself, mikri dibur chayil, this is called weekday non-Shabbos speech, v'asur, and it is asur, v'chanal b'reish ha-siman, like we learned in the beginning of the Siman, that you're talking during the week, during Shabbos, is not supposed to be the same as you're talking during the week. Continues the Mechaber top line. Aval, however, the Mechaber just gave us a case. He just told us a halacha, and he said that if you have apples that are muktzah, that are outside of the tchum, since the apples are muktzah, and muktzah is an issur d'rabbanan she'ein by tzad heter, you're not allowed to go on Shabbos to the edge of the tchum and camp out by the edge of the tchum on Shabbos, because that's doing an activity in order to facilitate doing something after Shabbos that is also on Shabbos. So that's when you're not allowed to do that. Now, says the Mechaber, Aval yochal lahachshich b'soif atchum kedei lemar leilech sham l'shamram. How about if you have these apples that are muktzah, that are outside of the tchum, and you're afraid that somebody might come and steal them? So you're fretting on Shabbos, even though you shouldn't. You shouldn't be fretting on Shabbos. Remember what we said. On Shabbos, it's supposed to be that you don't have a care in the world. All of your work for the rest of your life is done. On Shabbos, you have nothing to worry about. But this guy is sitting on Shabbos and he's worrying about his apples that are located outside of the tchum. Somebody might steal them. And the apples are also muktzah. So now what this guy wants to do is, he wants to go on Shabbos to the edge of the tchum, so that right after Shabbos, he could quickly go outside of the tchum and get to his apples. What does he want to do with his apples when he gets there? He don't want to do anything with them. He just wants to watch them. He wants to take out a Gemara, and he wants to chazer daf yomi sitting in a chair next to his warehouse of apples. He's on guard duty. That's what he wants to do. Says the Mechaber, you're allowed to go to the edge of the tchum on Shabbos in order to do that. Why? Because what's the mimtzai chefzecha over here? Mimtzai chefzecha is when you perform an activity on Shabbos in order to facilitate doing something after Shabbos that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. So, if you have apples that are on the tree, and you want to camp out at the edge of the tchum on Shabbos, so that right after Shabbos, you could go out of the tchum and pick an apple. Are you allowed to pick an apple on Shabbos? No, you're not. So, are you allowed to go to the edge of the tchum on Shabbos so that you could pick the apple right after Shabbos? No, because you're going to the edge of the tchum, you're doing an activity on Shabbos, walking to the edge of the tchum and camping out there. For what purpose? To facilitate picking the apple after Shabbos. And picking the apple is something that's also to do on Shabbos. But that's not our case here. Our case here is that after Shabbos, you don't want to pick an apple. All you want to do after Shabbos is you want to go out of the tchum, pull up a chair, sit down, learn the daf, and be doing guard duty over your apples. Is there any issur in doing guard duty on Shabbos? No. Which one in the Lamites Malachas is it? It's not an issur d'oraisa, it's not an issur d'rabbanan. What are you doing? You're not doing anything. So in this case, when you're going to the edge of the tchum on Shabbos, why are you doing it? You're doing it because you want to be able to go out of the tchum right after Shabbos. That's okay. Going out of the tchum is an issur sheyesh by tzad heter. So you're allowed to camp out at the edge of the tchum in order to facilitate going out of the tchum after Shabbos. That's okay, because going out of the tchum is an issur sheyesh by tzad heter. The other reason that you're camping out at the edge of the tchum is to do guard duty. Doing guard duty is also something that you're allowed to do on Shabbos. So in this case, going to the edge of the tchum on Shabbos is not an issur of mimtzai chefzecha, because you're not doing it in order to facilitate doing anything after Shabbos that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. That's what the Mechaber says. Aval yochal lahashich b'soif atchum kedei lemar leil sham l'shamram, to watch the apples that are muktzah. Why? Shafilu haya hayoim. Shafilu hayoim haya yochal l'shamram imem hayu b'soif atchum. There's no issur in watching over the apples. If these apples that are muktzah would be located in your backyard, so they would be in the tchum, would you be allowed on Shabbos to pull up a chair in the backyard and learn daf yomi by a chair in the backyard next to the apples so nobody steals your apples? Yeah, it would be 100% mutter. So therefore, you could be machshich b'soif atchum in order to do this. Says the Mishnah Kat Lamed Zayin, Shafilu hayoim ritzayin lomar. What the Mechaber wants to say is nimtza she'etzam hashmira have a malacha hamuteres b'Shabbos. Watching over the apples is not a davar aser on Shabbos. It's a davar that's mutter on Shabbos. Umashich b'shvil davar hamutter. So you're camping out at the edge of the tchum so that you should be able to do something after Shabbos that's mutter. It's not aser. Umashu chutz l'tchum. Aye, you're camping out at the edge of the tchum so that right after Oy Shabbos you could go out of the tchum. That's okay. This is an Isser Sheish by Tzad Heter, because if there would be Burgan in it, would be Mutter. It's not inherently Aser. Fine. Let's finish up this sif. Second line down near the end of the line. Says the Mechaber, adds another point here. Let's say you have these apples that are muktzah, that are located outside of the tchum. Are you allowed to go to the edge of the tchum on Shabbos in order to take them after Shabbos? No. Why? Because of the Isser of Muktzah. The Isser of Muktzah is an Isser she'ein by Tzad Heter. Are you allowed to go to watch over them? Yes, because watching over them is a davar mutter. So you're allowed to go to the edge of the tchum to facilitate doing a davar mutter after Shabbos. Now, says the Mechaber like this, V'im loy kivein lahachshich ela l'shamra. Let's say you went to the edge of the tchum on Shabbos. Why? So that you could watch over your apples. So what you did was 100% mutter. You went to the edge of the tchum on Shabbos. You camped out. You watched the clock. It's 72 minutes after Shkia. You said, Baruch HaMavdil B'Kodesh L'Chayil. You went out of the tchum. You pulled up a chair. You opened up your Gemara. You're learning Daf Yomi, and you're doing guard duty. Everything is fine. Now you look at the apples and you say, you know, my chaver Ruvain would really appreciate one of these apples. Are you allowed to take the apple and bring it back home and give it to your friend Ruvain? Yes. Now, why would you think no? The reason you would think no is because would you have been allowed to camp out at the edge of the tchum in order to get that apple? No, because the apple was muktzah. So to camp out at the edge of the tchum in order to get the apple, that would have been aser. But over here, that's not what you did. You camped out at the edge of the tchum to watch over the apples, and that's mutter. Now that you did it for a reason that's mutter, you're allowed to take the apple, bring it home, and give it to your friend. What the Mechaber means is, even if the apples are still on the tree, after Shabbos, when you go out of the tchum, could you pick an apple and bring it home for your friend? Yes, you can. Because that's not why you camped out. You didn't camp out at the edge of the tchum in order to pick the apple. That would have been a problem. But you camped out at the edge of the tchum in order to watch over the apple. And that is not a problem. Woo! Okay, let's move on to Siftes. Says the Mechaber. More on this concept of camping out at the edge of the tchum in order to facilitate doing something after Shabbos. Motor lahachshich, you're allowed to camp out at the edge of the tchum at the end of Shabbos, meaning you're allowed to go there. No, change, backtrack. We're not talking here in Siftes, we're not talking about at the edge of the tchum. Motor lahachshich, you're allowed to go someplace and spend Shabbos evening, going into the end of Shabbos, litloish peiros va'asavim miginasai, to pick fruits or herbs from your garden, v'churvasai, or a field, shebesoich hatchum, that's inside the tchum. In other words, you have a field where you grow tomatoes. Now your tomato patch is inside the tchum, but it's a 15-minute walk away from your house. Now, you want to have some fresh tomatoes for Malava Malka. You don't want to be home by Havdalah, make Havdalah, then have to go 15 minutes to get the tomatoes, and 15 minutes to come back home, so that you're not going to be able to have your fresh tomatoes until a half hour after Shabbos is over. What you want to do is, Shabbos after Mincha, you want to walk 15 minutes to your field, you want to pull up a chair by your field, and then, right when Shabbos is over, you'll pick a tomato, and then you'll come home. Are you allowed to do that? Now, let's think about it. In a sense, you could see a reason why this would be aser. Why? Because you're doing an activity, you're walking 15 minutes to your field, you're camping out near your field. For what purpose? So that after Shabbos, you should be able to do something that's aser on Shabbos. Pick a tomato. So it sounds a little bimtzai hefzecha. The problem is, not the problem, but we're going to see that this is mutter. The reason it's mutter is because we learned all the way in the beginning of Shin Vav, we learned that Mimtzai Cheftzecha is only aser when it's a minkara milsa, when people could tell that you're camping out over there in order to do something after Shabbos that's aser. It has to be, so to speak, obvious. Over here, the Mechaber is going to say it's not obvious. Again, says the Mechaber, Motor lahachshich, you're allowed to camp out at the end of Shabbos, litloish peros va'asavim, in order to pick fruit or herbs or vegetables, meginosai from your garden, v'chorbasai, from your patch, shebesoich hatchum, if it's located inside the tchum. We only aser camping out in order to do something after Shabbos that's aser if you're doing it at the edge of the tchum. Why? Misham deminka remilsa. Let me give you a heads up on what the Mishnah Beurah is going to say. The Mishnah Beurah is going to say that when people see somebody walk to the edge of the tchum, back in the day, everybody knew where the edge of the tchum was. When people see somebody camped out at the edge of the tchum, they right away realize that the reason you're there is because you want to go take care of something right after Shabbos. But inside the city limits, if you happen to be going for a walk and you happen to be somewhere, it's not called minkara milsa. It's not obvious that the reason you went there is in order to facilitate doing something that's also on Shabbos right after Shabbos. Now, the Mishnah Beurah is going to say that if you go and you pull up a chair right next to your tomato patch, that would be a problem. That is minkara milsa. Why is the guy sitting right next to his tomato patch? Obviously, he wants to pick a tomato right after Shabbos. So the Mishnah Beurah says that would be a problem. But when the Mechaber is talking about is not that you're going to pull up a chair right next to your tomato patch. You're going to go in the vicinity of where your tomato patch is. When somebody sees you a block away from your tomato patch, they don't assume that the reason that you're there is to be very close to your tomato patch to pick a tomato. You went there to visit somebody, or you went for a walk. Yeah, it happens to be that you have a tomato patch down the block. So again, to sit down in a chair at the edge of the tomato patch, that would be a problem. But to be in the vicinity of the tomato patch, that's not a problem. Says the Mishnah Cut Lamites. Litleish Paris. But we're talking about that you're not standing or sitting right next to the garden. The Ilavachi, if you would be, it would be considered Milka Remilsa since you're standing right there. It would be obvious to everybody that you're camping out by the field in order to do something in the field on Masi Shabbos, where we said this would be aser. Ois kat mem, mishom de minkara milsa. When we say that it's aser to camp out at the edge of the tchum, that's also because that's minkara milsa. Ava b'soichat tchum, but as long as you're within the boundaries of the tchum, loy minkara milsa al mahu machshich, we don't consider that to be minkara milsa. We don't consider it to be recognizable that you're camped out in that location in order to do something after Shabbos that's also on Shabbos. This is not the same as what we learned in Shin Vav Sif Aleph, that you're not allowed to, let's say, go into your rental property and look over your rental property on Shabbos. We said in Shin Vav Sif Aleph, you can't go into your field and look to see what needs weeding and what needs plowing, even if it's within the tchum. So even if you have a garden that's inside the tchum, you're not allowed to go for a spazier inside your tchum to go see where you have to prune and where you have to weed and where you have to hoe and where you have to plow. The Hasam, because over there, because when you're in the field, everybody understands you're there to look at the needs of the field and to decide what labors you have to do inside the field. If it's almost plowing time, or it's almost harvest time, or it's time to hoe the fields from weeds, that obviously would be an Isser of Mimtzai Chefzecha. V'lachein Osir Gamkein Gemara l'tayil al Pesach HaMedina k'dei lotzis b'shechashecha l'merchas hasamach la shahim and hagam lahamid hamerchas eisel shara ir b'soifa hakol mitam zeh. This is why we said in the beginning of Shin Vav, you're not allowed to go to the gate of the city and camp out by the gate of the city. Because everybody knows that the Beis HaMerchatz, the bathhouse, is right outside the gate of the city, and it's going to be obvious to everybody that you're camped out by the gate of the city because you want to chop the best shower in the house right away on Moshe Shabbos. So that would be Mimtzah Chefzecha. So again, when the Mechaber says that if you have a field inside the Tchum, you're allowed to go over there on Shabbos, not if you're going to go into the field, not if you're going to sit right next to the field. Then it's Minka Ramilsa that you're doing it in order to see what the field needs, in order to plan doing things after Shabbos that are also on Shabbos. But if that's not what you're doing, if you're just going in the vicinity, then it's not Minka Ramilsa, it's not Mimtzah Chefzecha. Masha'e came in Yaneinu loy Minka Ramilsa el kishamachshich b'seif atchum she'az nira shamachshich kidei lasis achakach b'motzei Shabbos davar she'yu asal asaisi b'Shabbos. So we come okay. Nevertheless, in a aser el kishakavanasai be'emes lazeh. Here the Mishnah Berurah gives us a very important piece of information. All of these places where we say you're not allowed to be machshich, that you're not allowed to spend the end of Shabbos near something to do something after Shabbos, it's only if that's really your kavanah. Avalim kavanaseh lahashich kidei leilich achakach balayla mutter. But if the only reason you're at the edge of the tchum is because you want to travel after Shabbos, that would be okay. That's a mahalicha and it variser, because again, the act of walking outside of the tchum is not inherently aser. It's an iser sheyesh by tzad heter kidei le'el besif ches. Boy, I'm telling you, it's complicated stuff. Says the Mechaber Sif Yud. Motor loyma l'chaveira, you're allowed to say to your friend, you're allowed to make the following deal, the following agreement with your friend on Shabbos. So you have Ruvain and you have Shimon. Ruvain and Shimon, the way they began Shabbos, they each have a different tchum. I'm not going to go into the cases, we'll save that for Chelik Dalet. But you could have cases where two different people who are relatively near each other, still have different Tchum Shabbos. So Reuben and Shimon each have a different Tchum Shabbos. Now, Shimon happens to have an apple orchard that's within Reuven's Tchum. And Reuven has a tomato patch that's within Shimon's Tchum. So Reuven's tomato patch is out of his Tchum, but it's within Shimon's Tchum. Shimon's apple orchard is out of his Tchum, but it's within Reuven's Tchum. So they make the following deal. We said that to pull up a chair and watch over your Paris on Shabbos is mutter. To do shmira is mutter. So Shimon tells Reuven, you watch my apples that are within your Tchum, and I'll watch your tomatoes that are within my Tchum. Are you allowed to make this agreement on Shabbos? Says the Mechaber, yes. You watch my produce that's within your tchum, and I'll watch your produce that's within my tchum. Says the Mishnah cut mem aleph, shmarli, hainu afilu ayoim. They're allowed to make this agreement even to do the shmira on Shabbos itself. What's the chiddush over here? If there's nothing usher on Shabbos about watching Paris, so why should this be usher? Why would we dream that this is usher? Explains the Mishnah Berurah why. You might think that this is like hiring a worker on Shabbos. You're not allowed to hire workers on Shabbos. That's Mitzvah Chefzecha. Maybe this agreement schmecks of hiring workers, says the Mechaber. No. Moving along to Sif Yod Aleph. Interesting halacha. Hashayel davar mechaveroi. If somebody borrows something from his friend, la yomer loy halveni. Now we're talking here Lashon HaKodesh or Aramaic. So there's two different words that could be used for borrowing. In English, we use borrowing and lending. In Aramaic, in Hebrew, there were two different words. There's she'ela, right? A shoyel is a borrower. A she'ela is a loan, right? So, or you could say halveni. Well, a halva is a loan. A malve is a lender. A loive is a borrower. So the word halveni, lend me, and the word hashileni are two words that mean almost the same thing. They both mean lend to me. Yet, what it says here in halacha is that these two words have two different connotations. The connotation of halveni is a loan that's a long-term loan. And I give you a very simple explanation of this. If you learn Daf Yomi, if you learn Gemara, if you've learned Baba Metzia, you know Stam Halva Shloishim Yom. The standard default length of a monetary loan was 30 days. So a halva, the word halveni, carries a connotation of long term. So if you want to borrow something that's mutter on Shabbos, you want to borrow potatoes, and you say halveni, the connotation is that that's for a minimum time period of 30 days. Hashileni does not carry that connotation. Hashileni also means lend to me, but it doesn't carry a long-term connotation. It carries only a short-term connotation. What's the difference? The difference is that when you make a long-term loan, you often memorialize it in a written agreement. You document it. When you make a short-term loan, you don't necessarily document it. Therefore, the Mechaber says, when you borrow something on Shabbos, do not say halveni, because halveni carries the connotation of long-term. Long-term often comes together with documentation. You're not allowed to document things on Shabbos. Kaisiv, it's an Issa Daraisa. So don't say halveni. Instead, say hashileni, because hashileni is short-term, doesn't carry the connotation of documentation. We don't have to worry that you might come to kaisiv. So let's see it inside, says the Mechaber. If you borrow, one who borrows something from his friend, lo yomer lo halveni, he should not use the expression halveni. Demashmal is man meruba, because that carries the connotation of a long-term loan. And therefore you have to be afraid that they might come to document it, and that would be a problem of kaisiv. Ella rather, yomer lo hashileni, he should use the expression of hashileni, which does not carry that connotation. In English or in Yiddish or in other languages where there is no such distinction between different types of expressions, then you shouldn't say lend me. You should say give to me. Don't say lend, because lend carries this risk of documentation. Says the Mishnah cut membeis Lizman Meruba. Why is it that halveni carries a connotation of a long-term loan? Because a default loan period is 30 days. And therefore we have to worry that they might write up a contract. But she'ela, which always connotes a short-term loan, in places where they don't follow this rule of stam halva shloishim yom, then Rashai Lomer Alveni. If a taka doesn't carry a connotation of long-term, then the Magen Avraham says you could say Alveni. But the Chavetz Chaim and the Beurah Halacha says this is not so clear. Ice cut mem gimel. What's the problem here? You have to be concerned that it might come to documentation. Kasar Pri Begadim writes b'shem Rashba. The balashon halva loy mahani afilu imasti imoisham aveil raklis man muit. A wise guy will come and he'll say, I'm going to use the word halveni. You're worried that it has a connotation of a long-term loan. I'm going to say halveni, but only for short-term. You're not allowed to do that. The loy polag rabbanon. Oid Kasar Pri Begadim, the Begadim also writes that afilu lavas farim shu dvar mitzvah gamkein lo yarma lashon halva. Even if you're doing a loan over here that has a mitzvah angle, you want to borrow a Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, so you could look up the Dirshu footnotes, you still don't use the expression of halva. The Mechaber said that in languages where the different words do not carry such distinctions, he said you should say tainly, give to me. You shouldn't use a word that connotes borrowing at all. Says the Mishnah Mem Dalet. Somebody is going to be afraid if you say give me, I don't want to give it to you, because that sounds like I'm giving it to you for nothing. So you know what you could say? You could say, give it to me and I will give it back to you. So you're just avoiding the use of the word borrow and lend. Give it to me and I'll give it back. Now let's go to the Ramah. It says the Ramah 4 lines up off the bottom. Let's just finish this sif. Let's say you borrow something from somebody on Shabbos, but this is not a close friend of yours, and the person wants to be sure that you're actually going to pay back what it is that you're borrowing. If you borrow something on Shabbos, and the lender doesn't want to trust you, you could leave him something for collateral. But when you give him the collateral, don't say, here, I'm giving this to you as a collateral. You go to borrow something, and the guy says, how do I know you're going to pay me back? Here, take this. But you don't tell him that it's collateral on the loan. Why? Because telling him I'm giving you a collateral, this is business activity. This is uvda d'choil. We don't arrange loans on Shabbos, and we don't pay things back on Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Beurah, Ois Koton Memhei, Yaniach Mashkain Etzloi, you could give the lender a collateral, V'davka Yain V'shemen V'davershu Tzara Shabbos. Loans that we're talking about over here, like we just said in the Ramah, we don't make loans on Shabbos. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about borrowing things that are Tzara Shabbos. You need wine for Kiddush. So you want to go over to somebody and you want to say, do me a favor, I need a bottle of Malvasia. And he wants to know that you're going to pay back, so you're going to give him a mashkin. So that's something that's a tzarich for Shabbos. Avaldava, or oil. You need oil for your salad dressing. Avaldava shed a tzarich Shabbos. But things that have nothing to do with Shabbos, also l'niachal of mashkin, you shouldn't make the loan, and you shouldn't leave him a collateral. We don't pay things back on Shabbos. Let's say you borrowed a cask of oil from somebody for 3 months. Also, leparam b'Shabbos, you don't pay it back on Shabbos. There's the problem by making a loan. We're afraid it might come to documentation. You might come to erase the loan from the ledger. If you say I'm returning it, not I'm repaying it, that's mutter to Isla Yakera, because you're using a different turn of phrase in order to make a hecker and to remind yourself that this is Shabbos, so we shouldn't come to erasure. But again, all of this activity should be restricted to things that are necessary for Shabbos. But if not, then we shouldn't be arranging loans or anything else, no matter what kind of phraseology we use. Thank you so much for joining me for Liban HaTorah. The source of Liban HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rabban Shalom should send Yeshua's Parnas and Shidduchim to all those in need. We should be Zeicher to see, to be Eskel Tzedek, B'meher v'yameinu, Amen. Be well.